There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a crowd when the world corrects itself in public. Not the silence of confusion. Not the silence of boredom or discomfort. The silence of 30 people simultaneously realizing that everything they assumed about someone was wrong, and that the person they had spent years underestimating was standing right in front of them, completely calm, watching them figure it out. That silence fell over the Callaway family ranch on a Saturday afternoon in late July, in the Cedar Hill country just outside San Antonio, Texas. And it fell because of a coin. A small, heavy brass challenge coin, worn smooth at the edges, dark with years of handling. On one face, the eagle and trident emblem of the Naval Special Warfare Command. On the other face, a call sign engraved in clean, precise capital letters that meant absolutely nothing to most people in that yard and everything to the two people who recognized it. WRAITH. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Because before the silence there was noise. Loud, warm, deeply familiar noise. The kind that only a large southern family produces when it gathers in a backyard with enough slow-smoked brisket, enough cold Shiner Bock, and enough accumulated history between people to fill 3 separate therapy sessions. Before the silence there was Derek. The Callaway family barbecue happened every summer without fail, and had happened every summer for as long as anyone could remember. It was one of those traditions that had calcified over decades into something close to sacred obligation. You came because you always came, because not coming required an explanation that nobody wanted to give, because the food was genuinely extraordinary and the children needed to see their cousins, and Uncle Gerald produced a brisket that was, by the objective consensus of everyone who had ever eaten it, one of the finest things to emerge from the state of Texas. The ranch itself had belonged to the family for 3 generations. 15 acres of cedar and live oak and scrub brush backing up against a dry limestone creek bed. A long gravel driveway lined with trucks and SUVs on gathering days. A wraparound porch that sagged slightly on the east end and had been sagging slightly on the east end for the better part of 20 years without anyone getting around to fixing it. The backyard was wide and flat and generous, dotted with folding lawn chairs and long tables covered in red checkered plastic tablecloths, a massive offset smoker pit off to one side where the brisket had been going since before dawn, and a growing archaeology of empty Shiner bottles near the back fence that told the story of the afternoon in chronological order. 40 people, give or take. Multiple generations. The kind of gathering where grandchildren who had never met were introduced and immediately found each other across a yard with the instinctive ease of children who understand that cousins are automatically interesting. The kind of gathering where old arguments got recycled and old stories got new details and someone always cried at least once, though usually for good reasons. It was, on its surface, a perfectly ordinary Texas summer afternoon. Elena Callaway had driven 4 hours to be here. She had not particularly wanted to come. This was not because she disliked her family. She loved them in the specific, complicated, structural way that you love people who knew you before you became whoever you eventually became, people who carry the early drafts of you in their memories whether you want them to or not. She loved her mother with a ferocity that was one of the few things in her life that required no qualification. She loved Uncle Gerald and his fishing stories and the way he laughed at his own punchlines 30 seconds before he reached them. She loved her Aunt Rosie, who expressed love exclusively through food, and whose tamales were the kind of thing you found yourself thinking about in quiet moments in foreign countries at strange hours of the night, when home felt very far away and very necessary. But coming home meant coming back inside a version of herself that other people had constructed in her absence. A version assembled from fragments and assumptions, and the particular human habit of filling in blanks with whatever story was most convenient. Coming home meant answering the same questions about the same subjects, and watching the same conclusions form in people's faces before she had finished speaking. And coming home meant Derek. Her mother had called 3 times over the course of 1 week. The third call had reached Elena at 11:40 at night in a parking garage in Tyson's Corner, Virginia, where she had been sitting in her car completing a phone debrief with her section chief that had run significantly longer than scheduled. When her mother's name appeared on the screen, Elena had looked at it for a long moment, the pull of 2 different worlds operating on her simultaneously, and let it go to voicemail. She had called back the following morning. "It's just the family, baby," her mother had said. "Come eat some food. People miss you." "I know, Mama. Derek's going to be there. But you just ignore him like you always do. You've always been so good at that." "I know, Mama." Gerald has been planning that brisket in his head since April. You know how he gets about it. Elena had smiled at her windshield. I'll drive down Friday night. She had packed a small bag, transferred her challenge coin from her work jacket to her jeans pocket out of pure absent-mindedness. She had carried it for so long it moved with her like a second skin, migrating between pockets without her noticing, and driven south into the darkening hill country. Derek Calloway was 37 years old and operated in the world with the complete, unexamined confidence of a man who had never once been seriously challenged. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with an easy smile that landed well on first meeting and revealed its operational purpose only after extended exposure. He had built a moderately successful used car dealership in Austin, drove a pearl white F-250 with custom chrome rims and a vanity plate that announced his profession to anyone who cared to look, and wore his local success like an expensive coat he never took off. At family gatherings, Derek held court. He positioned himself near the cooler, where traffic was highest, and delivered opinions nobody had asked for with the absolute authority of a man who assumed that his voice was the most important one in any room he entered. His stories grew slightly with each telling, which everyone knew and nobody mentioned, because the stories were genuinely entertaining in their inflated versions and deflating them would have served no useful social purpose. He and Elena had grown up together. Same family, same holidays, same long hot summers at the ranch, same grandmother. As children, Derek had been the one who organized the games and established the rules and decided the hierarchies with the casual authority of someone who had never been told he didn't have that authority. Elena had been the one who wandered off alone, to the creek, to the barn, to wherever there was something interesting to look at or think about, and came back when the food was ready. Derek had never known what to do with her. She didn't compete with him, which deprived him of the satisfaction of winning. She didn't seek his approval, which deprived him of the pleasure of granting it. She didn't perform her intelligence for an audience, which meant he couldn't dismiss it as showing off. She simply existed quietly, completely, sufficiently, in a way that he found without ever being able to articulate why faintly threatening. So he had spent 30 years making small, casual, half-joking observations about her life choices, about the government job that produced no visible fruit, the apartment nobody had ever visited, the beat-up car, the absences, the lack of anything he recognized as success. He offered these observations in the tone of a man sharing honest concern, which was, on some level, how he experienced them. Elena had listened to them for 30 years, said very little in return, and continued to be exactly who she was. She arrived at the ranch on Friday evening when the light was going gold over the cedar hills and the air carried the thick green smell of coming rain. Her mother met her at the car before she had finished parking, appeared at the driver's window with the speed of someone who had been watching the driveway, and Elena stepped out into a hug that lasted a long time. The kind of hug that does the work of all the phone calls that didn't happen and all the visits that got canceled and all the accumulated distance between a life lived in classified spaces and a family waiting patiently in the ordinary world. "You look thin," her mother said, pulling back and studying her with the focused diagnostic intensity of a woman for whom love and feeding were inseparable. "I'm fine, Mama." "You're not fine. Thin. Come inside, I have King Ranch from Tuesday. The party's tomorrow. Come inside." Elena came inside. She sat at the kitchen table of the house she had grown up in and ate reheated King Ranch casserole and listened to her mother talk about the garden, about the neighbor's new dog that barked at the deer, about the ongoing saga of the church roof repair fund that had been ongoing for what felt like several years now, and felt something in her chest gradually loosen that she hadn't fully registered as tight until it began to release. She slept 10 hours in her childhood bedroom under the quilt her grandmother had made, with the window cracked and the smell of cedar and the sound of the creek coming through on the breeze. She had not slept 10 consecutive hours in longer than she cared to calculate. The next afternoon the family arrived in waves that built toward a comfortable chaos by 2 o'clock. 40-odd people across 4 generations. Children who had learned to walk since the last gathering and were deploying this new skill with maximum ambition. Teenagers who existed in that particular social purgatory of being too old for the kid table and not yet old enough for the adult conversations they wanted to participate in. Adults in various configurations of lawn chairs and folding tables, talking over each other with the comfortable overlapping energy of people who had been talking over each other for decades and had long since stopped finding it rude. Elena moved through it with the same quality of attention she brought to every environment. observant, unhurried, present without drawing attention to her presence. She hugged people and answered the standard questions. Still Virginia, yes. Still the government thing, yes. No, not married. Yes, Rosie, she was eating fine, she was absolutely eating fine. She carried out a second tray of ribs when Rosie's hands were full. She got genuinely swept up in Gerald's account of a kayaking trip on the Frio River that had ended in a way suggesting the kayak had never been structurally trustworthy to begin with. She was, for the first 3 hours of the gathering, completely unremarkable. Derek found her at the drink table around 3:30. He materialized at her elbow with his second beer and his performance smile, the one that appeared when he had already decided what he was going to say, and was simply choosing the moment to say it. Elena, you actually made it. How long has it been? 2 years. About that. He looked at her the way he always looked at her. A quick inventory, checking for evidence of the success he understood and recognized. You look tired. Long drive. Still the government thing? Something like that. He laughed, comfortable, slightly condescending, the laugh of a man who found her vagueness more quaint than mysterious. 4 languages and a full scholarship to UT, he said. You could have gone into finance. Tech built something real. Instead he gestured with his beer. I don't know. Filing reports in Virginia. Something like that, she said again. He laughed again and moved on, already looking for his next audience. She watched him go. She picked up her sweet tea. She breathed slowly. The afternoon deepened. The brisket came off the pit to a response that was slightly reverent, which was the appropriate response. People filled their plates and found their chairs. A horseshoe competition developed near the back fence with the serious competitive energy that emerges whenever the Callaway uncles have been drinking beer in the sun for 2 hours. The music on the speaker shifted from country to classic rock as the afternoon wore on, which meant the younger generation had gained control of someone's phone. Elena was sitting at a picnic table near the edge of the yard, half present in a conversation between 2 of her aunts about a kitchen renovation that had gone significantly over budget, when she reached into her pocket for her phone. Her fingers closed around the coin instead. She pulled it out without thinking and set it on the table beside her paper plate while she retrieved her phone from the other pocket. Then set the phone down and looked at the coin for a moment the way you look at something that has been part of your daily life for so long that you have stopped seeing it. Brass. About the size of a $50. Worn to a dark honey color from years of daily handling. The eagle and trident on one side. On the other, a sequence of numbers that were not random, a small geometric designator, and the call sign in clean, precise capitals. WRAITH. She had carried this coin for 9 years. It had been in her pocket on a surveillance operation in a country she was officially not in. It had sat on a hotel nightstand in 3 separate cities during 3 separate operations, while she ran human assets whose safety was entirely her responsibility. It had been in her hand during a 17-hour stretch of sustained analytical work that had produced intelligence that had changed the operational picture in a way she would never be able to describe to anyone outside a specific clearance level. It had traveled with her across 12 years of work that would leave no public trace, the one physical object that connected the woman eating brisket in a Texas backyard to the woman she actually was when she was doing the work. She had not meant to bring it to the barbecue. It lived in her work jacket. It had migrated without her noticing. She should have put it back in her pocket immediately. She did not because she got distracted and because Derek had already seen it and was already walking over. He came with his 3rd beer and the comfortable ownership of a man who treated other people's belongings as objects of casual public interest. He picked up the coin without asking, a habit that had irritated Elena since childhood and that she had long since stopped expecting him to change. What's this? He turned it in his fingers, squinted at the engraving. Is this a military thing? It's mine. Please put it down. WRAITH. He said the call sign the way someone reads a word they don't recognize, sounding it out slightly amused. What's that, like a video game name? A nickname? It's nothing. Please put it down, Derek. He set it on the table, but his attention didn't leave it. He tilted his head slightly, the specific angle his head took when he was constructing something. Around the table, a small audience had gathered in the organic way that audiences gather around Derek at family events. Cousin Bethany, 29, pretty and slightly sharp, Uncles Ray and Dennis, both in their 50s, The kind of men who defaulted to whoever was projecting the most confidence. Jim Haverford, 63, a retired electrician who had been coming to these gatherings since before Elena was born, and was fundamentally a good man who had the unfortunate habit of not leaving when the social weather changed. Derek looked at Elena. He had the expression of a man who had been building towards something all afternoon and had finally decided this was the moment. "Can I just say something?" he said. "And I'm saying this because we're family and I actually care." Elena said nothing. "You had a full scholarship to UT. For languages. You were genuinely the smartest person in this family. Maybe the smartest person I've ever personally known. And you've spent 12 years doing some vague government job that you won't talk about, living in an apartment nobody's ever seen, driving a car that's older than some of my employees." He paused. He let that sit. Then, "You've got nothing to show for any of it, Elena. No house. No company. No nothing you can point to. I've built something. I've got something real." His voice had dropped into something that sounded almost like genuine concern, which made it worse somehow than if it had been pure contempt. "From where I'm standing, you're kind of a nobody. Like genuinely. You're a ghost. You worked your whole life and you ended up invisible. Nobody." The word landed in the summer air and stayed there. The people around the table had gone completely still. Bethany wasn't laughing anymore. Ray and Dennis had the expressions of men who were very slowly realizing they did not want to be where they were. Jim Haverford had stopped moving his drink toward his mouth mid-gesture and had not resumed. Elena picked up her challenge coin. She closed her fingers around it slowly. She looked at her cousin with the same expression she had worn all afternoon, calm, present, entirely self-contained. The expression she had spent years developing in conditions considerably more hostile than a Texas barbecue. She did not flinch. She did not flush with anger or embarrassment. She did not look away. And that was the moment the gate at the side of the yard opened. Thomas Rourke was 61 years old and looked like someone had taken the concept of a career military man and made it literal in human form. He was broad through the chest and shoulders, moving with the unhurried, deliberate economy of someone who had never stopped training and whose body had consequently never stopped being the body of an operator. His face was angular and weathered, creased around the eyes from years of squinting into sun and wind, the face of a man who had spent the majority of his adult life outdoors in extreme conditions. His hair was iron gray and cut military short out of habit rather than necessity. His eyes were pale gray and carried a quality Elena recognized from the first moment she saw him across the yard, the quality of absolute, total presence, the look of someone who was completely in every room they entered, registering everything, missing nothing. He was Cassie Rourke's father. Cassie had been Elena's closest friend from the age of 8 to 18, the girl from 2 ranches down the road who had spent so many summers at the Callaway place that Elena's mother had practically adopted her as a second daughter. They had stayed in contact across years and distance in the way of people whose friendship was built on something solid enough to survive long gaps without requiring constant maintenance. Cassie had texted the previous night. Her father was in San Antonio visiting. He'd heard there was a family gathering. She'd mentioned it to him almost as an aside, not really expecting it to land as an invitation. He had said simply that he'd like to stop by and pay his respects to Elena's mother, whom he'd known for 30 years. Elena had texted back, "Of course, please come." She had not thought about it again. She was thinking about it now. Rourke came through the gate with a 6-pack of Shiner Bock under one arm, and his eyes moved across the yard in the single comprehensive sweep of someone whose threat assessment instincts had outlasted his active service by a decade. He cataloged the yard in under 3 seconds, found Elena, changed direction immediately and walked toward her. He was 10 feet away when his eyes dropped to her hand. He slowed. At 6 feet he could read the coin. His pace reduced further, almost to a stop, and then he stopped completely. What happened in his face was not dramatic. There was no sharp intake of breath, no widening of the eyes, no performance of recognition. What happened was something much quieter and, for that reason, significantly more powerful. Something in the careful construction of his neutral expression shifted at a very deep level, the way a mechanism shifts when the correct key engages it. Not surprise. Not shock. Something older and more fundamental than either of those things. Recognition. He knew that coin. Not the specific coin, he had never held this one, had never seen it before today. But he knew what it was and what it meant and what category of person carried it. He knew the world it came from. He had been in that world for 26 years and the world had never fully left him, even after he had left it. He set the six-pack down on the table. The pocket of yard around the picnic table, which had been held in the specific suspended silence of Derek's final statement, went even quieter, if that was possible. Thomas Rourke came to attention. It was not performed. It was not staged. It was the automatic, muscle memory response of a man whose body had been trained over decades to recognize certain things and respond to them in certain ways, and those responses had proven more durable than his active service. Spine straight, feet together, shoulders squared, chin level, eyes forward, and then with the measured deliberateness of a man who understood exactly the weight of what he was doing, he raised his right hand to his temple in a full and formal military salute. The silence that fell over the yard was total. Not just the picnic table. The whole yard or the portion of it that was close enough to see. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Gerald looked up from his smoker. Somebody's child, running full speed toward the horseshoe pit, slowed and stopped for reasons they couldn't have explained. Derek's beer had stopped moving. It was suspended halfway between the table and his mouth, held there by a brain that had temporarily run out of instructions. Bethany's hand was at her mouth. Ray and Dennis had gone completely motionless. Jim Haverford was staring with an expression that suggested he was storing every detail of what he was witnessing with the specific intentionality of a man who knows he will be describing this moment for the rest of his life. Elena looked at Thomas Rourke for a long, still moment. Something moved in her face. Private, not quite readable, something that lived underneath her composure rather than replacing it. Something that recognized the gesture for exactly what it was and received it accordingly. She straightened in her chair, squared her shoulders, raised her right hand to her temple and returned the salute cleanly. Rourke lowered his hand. When he spoke, his voice was low and even, a conversational volume. But in the absolute silence of the yard, every single person within 40 feet heard every word with perfect clarity. "Wraith," he said. "I've heard that call sign one time before this afternoon. Kandahar. August 2017. My team was moving on a compound on the east side of the city. We had been burned before we moved. Somebody had compromised our position before we even left the staging area. We were pinned down for 11 hours. No exfil window. 3 of my guys were going to come home in boxes." He paused for a moment, not for effect but in the way of someone being precise. They didn't. Because at hour 8 of those 11 hours, someone restructured the entire intelligence picture from the analysis side, pulled assets that nobody in that valley was supposed to know existed, identified and closed the leak, opened a window out. Another pause. Afterward, I was told the operation had been run at a classification level above my access. I was told I would never know who ran it. The exact words were, "She doesn't exist." He looked down at the coin in Elena's hand, then back up at her face. "That coin," he said, "suggests otherwise." His eyes moved, once briefly, with no particular hostility but with an absolute and devastating clarity, to Derek. Then back to Elena. "Whatever she's told you she does," he said. "She's told you more than she's legally required to." He held Elena's gaze with the simple, direct recognition of one professional acknowledging another across the only vocabulary that fully applied. "It is an honor, ma'am." Elena held his gaze for a moment. "Thank you, Master Chief," she said. The silence held for another 3 or 4 seconds, and then slowly the yard began to breathe again. Somewhere a child called out. Gerald turned back to his smoker. The music, which had not actually stopped, became audible again. Life resumed because life resumes, because the machinery of a family gathering has its own momentum. But something had permanently changed. The change was invisible and total, the way the air changes after lightning. You could not point to it. You could not explain it to someone who hadn't been there. But every person in that yard felt it in their bones. Derek Calloway stood at the exact center of that change. He was, as previously established, a smart man. He had built a business from nothing. He could read a room. He understood, with the immediate visceral comprehension that bypasses analysis and lands as pure knowing, exactly what had just occurred. the woman he had been publicly performing contempt at for the past 20 minutes, the woman he had called a nobody to her face in front of family, in front of neighbors, the woman he had spent 30 years casually diminishing, had just been formally saluted by a decorated combat veteran who had credited her, specifically, with saving the lives of his team in a classified operation in a war zone, in front of everyone. On a Saturday afternoon in a Texas backyard, he stood very still. Bethany had moved away from him. Not dramatically, not obviously, a quiet half-step and a turn of the body, the kind of physical withdrawal that is only visible if you are specifically watching for it. Ray and Dennis had found somewhere else to be with the efficient vagueness of men who had no desire to be associated with the wrong side of something. Jim Haverford had taken his drink to the far end of the yard and was standing with his back to the table, looking at the hills. Derek set his beer down on the table. He looked at it. He did not pick it up again. He looked across the yard to where Elena had walked, to her mother, who was standing near the garden gate with both hands pressed flat against her mouth and tears running freely and openly down her face. Not grief, not shock exactly. The tears of a woman who had known for years that her daughter was carrying something significant and invisible, who had felt the shape of it without ever being able to see it clearly, and who was watching it be seen by other people for the first time. He watched Elena walk to her mother and put her arms around her. He watched her mother hold on with both hands, the way you hold something precious that you have been being very careful with. Something in Derek Calloway's chest did something uncomfortable. Something that, in a man with less invested in his own construction, might have come out as tears, but in Derek came out instead as a long, slow exhale and a stillness that was different from his usual stillness, which was the stillness of a man who was always about to say something. This was the stillness of a man who had run out of things to say, and was sitting with that for the first time in his adult memory. What Thomas Rourke had not said because it was not his to say, and because classified information does not get shared on the basis of what would be emotionally satisfying in the moment, was the full scope of what the callsign WRAITH represented. What Rourke knew was one night, one operation, one specific convergence of his desperate circumstances and Elena's invisible intervention. It was a single data point, a fragment of a much larger architecture, a corner of a picture whose full dimensions would never be visible to anyone outside a very small and specific set of clearances. The full picture looked like this. Elena Christine Calloway had graduated from the University of Texas at Austin at 22 years old, summa cum laude, with a degree in applied mathematics and a minor in Arabic linguistics. She had been recruited directly from her senior year by an agency whose name she had never spoken aloud at a family function and never would. She had completed 18 months of the most rigorous operational training her agency offered, finished at the top of her cohort in every analytical assessment, and been assigned to a specialized unit that operated at the intersection of signals intelligence and human intelligence in active conflict zones. Over the 12 years that followed, she had built, from scratch, without institutional template or precedent, an analytical framework for mapping the financial networks used to move operational funding to hostile actors in 3 separate theaters of conflict. This framework had been tested in live operational conditions over 4 years, refined with each cycle, and had subsequently been adopted at the institutional level. As of today, it was still in active use. Its contributions to the disruption of funding networks could not be publicly quantified because the operations that depended on it could not be publicly acknowledged. She had personally handled human assets, individuals operating under sustained, mortal risk in environments where exposure meant death, in countries where the United States government had no official presence. She had maintained those relationships across years and multiple operational rotations. She had made the calls that determined which information moved and which did not, which relationships were sustainable and which had been compromised, which assets could be protected and how. Not one of those assets had been burned on her watch. She had been formally recognized on 3 separate occasions for analytical and operational contributions that had directly preserved American lives. These recognitions existed in classified files that most senior federal employees would never know existed. They would never appear on a wall. They would never be read at a ceremony. They would never be described in a speech or celebrated in a press release or trend on any platform. They had happened regardless. She drove a 12-year-old Civic because she spent enough time in enough locations that maintaining a more impressive vehicle would have been a logistical inconvenience rather than a pleasure, and because she genuinely did not care about cars. She lived in a modest apartment in Tyson's Corner because it was 12 minutes from her office on good traffic days and she valued those 12 minutes, and because the apartment had good morning light and a small balcony where she drank her coffee and could sometimes, on clear days, see the far edge of the Blue Ridge against the sky, which she found grounding in a way she had never tried to articulate. She looked tired because the work was genuinely exhausting in the deep cellular way of someone who had been operating at sustained high capacity in high-stakes environments for over a decade, and who had done so without the relief valve of being able to tell anyone about it. She had told her family none of this, not out of shame, not out of distance or coldness, but because the work existed in a world that had no natural interface with the world of Texas barbecues and church roof funds and Derek's used car dealership, and whether Gerald's brisket had hit the correct internal temperature. There was no bridge that could carry what she carried across that gap without distorting it beyond recognition. So she had carried it in the only way available to her, quietly, alone, without asking for acknowledgement. And she had been fine. She had been entirely and genuinely fine. Rourke took his six-pack to the far end of the yard and settled into a lawn chair beside Uncle Gerald and said something about bass fishing in the hill country, and Gerald's face produced the specific illumination it produced whenever someone expressed authentic interest in fishing, and within 90 seconds the two men were in a deep and completely absorbed conversation about current temperatures and fly selection that excluded the rest of the world with mutual contentment. Cassie arrived at 4:30, coming through the same gate her father had used an hour before. She stopped just inside it and took a single slow look around the yard, reading the arrangement of people, the quality of the silences, her father's satisfied expression at the far end, Elena's mother's red-rimmed eyes near the garden, and understood without being told that something significant had happened. She crossed the yard directly to Elena, who was now sitting in a lawn chair with a fresh sweet tea, and sat down beside her. "My father," Cassie said, "is constitutionally incapable of showing up somewhere without making it a moment. I apologize on his behalf." "He didn't mean to," Elena said. "He absolutely meant to," Cassie said. "He's been quietly strategic about things like this his entire life. He just does it so calmly that it looks accidental." She looked at Elena with the clear-eyed affection of a 30-year friendship that had survived distance and silence and multiple life chapters. "How are you actually doing?" "Better than I was an hour ago," Elena said, and meant it. Elena's mother settled into the third chair and the three of them talked about small things, comfortable things. A recipe Cassie was attempting to master that kept defeating her. A trip she was planning to visit her brother in Seattle. A book Elena's mother had been reading that had turned out to be surprisingly absorbing. The conversation moved at the natural pace of people who were comfortable with each other and had no performance to maintain. Around them the gathering continued. The horseshoe competition had reached a semi-final stage that was generating unreasonable amounts of competitive intensity. Gerald was making his rounds with the expression of a man whose brisket had, once again, demonstrated its mastery over the field. Children were winding down from the long afternoon with the particular fractious energy of people who are exhausted but refusing to admit it. The sun moved lower. The cedar hills went amber and then rose gold. Fireflies began to appear over the back fence, moving through the early dusk with their small intermittent lights. Elena reached into her pocket and touched the coin, the smooth worn edge, the raised lettering she could trace without looking. WRAITH. She had earned that name in places that did not appear on tourist maps, doing work that would never be celebrated in public, with a consistency and a thoroughness that had no audience other than the small number of people cleared to see it. She had carried it for 9 years across 12 years of work, as the one physical connection between the woman the world saw and the woman she actually was. She had never needed Derek Calloway's approval to know that the work mattered. She had never organized a single decision around whether he would understand it or respect it. His assessment of her life had landed with the dull weight of something she had been expecting, and she had absorbed it the way she absorbed many things, completely, without performance, and then set it aside. But she was human, and there was a specific particular weight to being continuously misread by people who should have known better, by people who had known you your whole life and had nonetheless constructed a version of you from the outside without ever bothering to ask what was actually there. That weight accumulated. You could be resilient and practiced and completely secure in your own identity and the weight still accumulated, Because you were human and the people who were supposed to love you still mattered to you even when they were failing at it. And then Thomas Rourke had walked through a gate with a 6-pack of beer, and in 45 seconds, without theater or drama or any intention of making a scene, had let the truth land exactly where it had always belonged. She picked up her sweet tea. She looked out across the yard, at her mother laughing at something Cassie had just said, at Gerald holding court near the cooler, at the children winding down in the long golden evening light. She felt, for the first time in a long time at a family gathering, entirely at peace. Derek came to find her at dusk. He came without his beer and without his audience and without the easy confident bearing that was normally as much a part of him as his height. He looked smaller somehow, without the performance equipment. Just a man walking across a yard toward his cousin. He stopped a few feet away. His face had the expression of someone who had spent the last 2 hours in a conversation with himself that he hadn't wanted to have and had arrived somewhere on the other side of it that was uncomfortable and necessary in equal measure. "Elena," he said. She turned and looked at him. "I owe you an apology," he said. The words came out without polish, without his usual smooth delivery. Slightly clumsy and undecorated, the way real apologies usually are when they're actual. Not just for today. For a lot of years of it. He stopped, gathered himself. "I had decided who you were a long time ago, and I didn't update it. I dismissed you in front of people today. I've been dismissing you in front of people for years. That was wrong." She looked at him without speaking. "I didn't know what you were doing," he said. "Obviously. But I don't think that's really the point, is it? The point is I had already decided you were less than you are. And I said that out loud. And I've been saying it in different ways for—" He rubbed the back of his neck. "For a long time." Elena was quiet for a moment. "Derek," she said, "what you think about me has never been the thing I organized my life around." She said it without cruelty and without performance, as a plain statement of fact. "I made my choices based on what I valued, not based on whether you would recognize it as success." He nodded. He took that without deflection. "I know," he said. "I think somewhere I've always known that. I think that's actually—" He stopped. Started again more carefully. "I think that's actually part of why I kept doing it. You never needed anything from me, and I didn't know what to do with that. So I found ways to make it your problem instead of mine." She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her expression shifted slightly, not into warmth exactly, but into something that acknowledged the difficulty and the honesty of what he had just said. "I hear you," she said. "I'm sorry, Elena. Genuinely. I know. I believe you." She didn't tell him it was fine, because it was not entirely fine and she wasn't going to perform forgiveness she hadn't fully arrived at. She didn't wrap it up with a gracious speech about the past being the past. But she received his apology as the real thing it was, and she acknowledged it accordingly, and she let that be enough for now. It was more than enough. It was a beginning. He looked at the ground, then back at her. "For what it's worth," he said, "I'm proud of you. I don't know what you've done. I'll probably never know what you've done. But I'm proud of you." She held his gaze for a moment. "Thank you, Derek," she said. He walked back across the yard. He found a chair at the edge of the gathering and sat in it alone, and for the rest of the evening he was quieter than anyone had ever seen him be at one of these gatherings. Not sulking, not retreating into wounded silence, but genuinely quiet, in the way of someone sitting with something important they are not yet done processing. The gathering wound down the way these things wind down, slowly at first and then all at once. Children were lifted from lawn chairs asleep and carried to vehicles. Coolers were hauled to truck beds. Leftover food was distributed by Rosie with the focused insistence of a woman for whom sending people home with containers was an act of devotion. Gerald made his final rounds with the quiet dignity of a man whose brisket had once again proven its point. Rourke found Elena near the gate as people were beginning to leave. He was carrying his empty 6-pack, relaxed and unhurried, with the ease of a man who had had a genuinely good afternoon. "Good people," he said, nodding toward the yard. "Most of them," she said. He smiled at that briefly. Then he looked at her with the directness that came from the specific authority of a man who had earned the right to say what he was about to say. "The work takes things," he said. "You know that better than I need to tell you. But it doesn't have to take everything." He looked at her steadily. You have people here who love you. They don't need to know what you've done. They just need you to show up. She looked out at the yard. Her mother near the garden gate, talking to Rosie. Gerald, the last of the children being buckled into car seats. I know, she said quietly. He nodded once. Picked up his six-pack. Take care of yourself, Wraith. She looked at him. You too, Master Chief. He walked out through the gate into the dusk. She watched him go. She stayed through Sunday and into Monday morning, longer than she had planned and longer than she had stayed in years. Sunday morning she helped her mother in the garden in the early heat, pulling weeds while her mother talked about the hummingbirds that came to the back porch feeder every summer without fail, marveling each time as though they were new. In the afternoon she sat with Gerald while he organized his tackle box and delivered a detailed analysis of soft plastic bait theory that she found herself genuinely engaged by, her mind doing what it always did, building models, finding patterns, discovering that the principles underlying good intelligence analysis and good bass fishing were, structurally, not entirely different. She called Cassie from the porch on Sunday evening and they talked for 2 hours about everything and nothing, and it was exactly like being 18 and exactly different from being 18 in all the right ways. She did not open her work email until Monday morning. When she finally drove north on Monday afternoon, the Cedar Hills falling away behind her and the highway opening ahead, she felt different than she had on the drive down. Not lighter exactly. The work was still the work and it would be waiting for her when she returned, with all its weight and its complexity and the particular loneliness of doing things that couldn't be described. But something had settled. Something had been named and seen and placed in its correct position, and the world had aligned briefly in a way that felt, if not healing exactly, then something adjacent to it. The coin was in her pocket. She reached in at a red light north of Austin and touched it the way she always touched it, the worn brass edge, the raised letters. Wraith. She had earned that name in the dark, in places that did not exist on maps, doing work that would not be celebrated in daylight. She had carried it across 12 years of quiet, sustained, consequential effort, without asking for an audience or arranging her life around approval from people who would never understand the terms of what she was doing. She had never needed Derek Calloway to tell her she mattered to know that she did. But she was human. And being continuously misread by people who were supposed to love you carried a weight that accumulated regardless of how secure and resilient and well-trained you were. It accumulated because you were human. Because their love mattered to you even when they were failing at it. Because that was not a weakness, it was the most fundamental human condition there was, and no amount of operational training changed it. And Thomas Rourke had walked through a gate on a Saturday afternoon with a six-pack of beer and, without theater or intention or any desire to make a scene, had let the truth find its place. She drove north into the deepening Texas evening. The sky ahead of her was going deep blue at the top and still orange at the horizon, wide and unbroken over the flat country. The radio played something she half recognized. The road was long and straight and open. She was a nobody to the people who hadn't looked. She was a ghost to the people who hadn't paid attention. She was Wraith to the people who had been in the dark with her, who understood what that name cost and what it built and what it protected. And she was Elena to her mother, who had held her in the garden with both hands and cried without embarrassment, and who would call on Tuesday morning the way she always called, and Elena would answer. She was all three of those things at once. She had always been all three of those things at once. The road stretched ahead. The work was waiting. The coin was warm in her pocket. The sky over Texas was extraordinary. She turned up the radio. She drove on. If you have ever been the quiet one, the one your family could not quite figure out, the one who got written off before anyone bothered to read, then you know that what happened in that yard was not about revenge. It was not about proving anything to anyone. It was simply about the truth settling at long last into its rightful place. And sometimes that is the only thing that ever needed to happen. Drop a comment if someone in your life has ever completely underestimated who you were, and then found out. We read every single one. Like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next story.